I never liked the basement in this house. From the day I moved in, it had a smell I couldn't quite name. Something damp and metallic, like rain-soaked pennies left in a dark jar. The walls were old poured concrete, the kind that sweats in humidity, and the wooden stairs creaked as though each step carried the weight of decades. I kept my boxes down there, the ones I wasn't ready to unpack, and I tried not to think about it. For weeks, it was only a shadow in the back of my mind. Until the humming began. It started on a Thursday night, sometime after midnight. I had been lying awake in my bedroom, the house silent except for the faint tick of an old wall clock. The air was heavy with the scent of cooling wood and the faint, earthy odor that always drifted up from below. I was on the edge of sleep when I heard it, a low, vibrating tone, almost too soft to be real. At first I thought it might be the refrigerator or the pipes expanding with the night air. But as I lay there, the sound sharpened. It was a hum, steady and deliberate, coming from beneath the floor. The tone wasn't musical. It wasn't the casual humming of a person distracted by chores. It was deeper, slower, a single note that never wavered. The kind of sound you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. I sat up, holding my breath. The house around me seemed to hold its own breath as well. The humming continued, unbothered by my attention. It was coming from the basement. I knew it as surely as I knew my own heartbeat. The next night, it came again. Just after midnight, a low vibration seeped up through the wooden floorboards. I placed my feet on the cool planks and felt it through the soles, a faint tremor like a distant generator buried deep in the earth. When I pressed my hand to the floor, the wood was faintly warm. Not hot, just alive. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The humming had grown louder, enough to rattle small objects on the dresser. My water glass quivered with tiny ripples, as if something massive moved far below. The air carried a faint scent of iron, sharp and metallic, mixing with the basement's usual dampness. It was the smell of old blood on wet stone. I told myself it was a failing furnace or a cracked pipe, but the furnace was silent. The pipes were cold. The power was steady. Every logical explanation slipped through my fingers like smoke. I decided to investigate. It was just past 1 in the morning when I crept down the hallway, every board under my feet protesting with dry groans. The door to the basement loomed at the end. The brass knob was cool and slightly slick, as if someone had been holding it moments before. I twisted it slowly. The hinges gave a soft metallic sigh. The smell hit me first, wet earth, rusted iron, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit left in a sealed jar. The air was colder, but thick, as though the basement held its own weather. I flicked the switch. The single bulb at the bottom flickered to life, bathing the steps in a sickly yellow glow. Shadows clung to the walls like damp rags. The humming didn't fade when I opened the door. If anything, it grew stronger, vibrating through the wooden railing into my fingertips. I started down, each step groaning beneath my weight. The sound filled the narrow stairwell until it was the only thing I could hear. No heartbeat, no breathing, just that endless note. At the bottom, I paused. The basement stretched before me in uneven patches of light. My boxes sat where I had left them, stacked against the far wall, their edges outlined in dust. The concrete floor was cold and slick beneath my socks. Tiny beads of moisture clung to the walls like sweat. The humming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned in slow circles, trying to pinpoint it. My ears buzzed with the effort, as if the sound lived inside my skull. I walked along the walls, touching the concrete. Each surface vibrated faintly, like a tuning fork struck and left to sing. I pressed my palm to a support beam, feeling a low, pulsing throb that almost matched the rhythm of breathing. The smell of iron was stronger here, tinged with something acrid and sweet. Then I noticed the drain. It sat in the center of the floor, a round iron grate I'd never paid attention to before. The humming was stronger here. When I knelt beside it, the air above the drain was strangely warm, rising in gentle waves against my face. I leaned closer. The sound wasn't just a hum anymore. It carried subtle textures, like many voices blending into a single, endless tone. My stomach tightened. I thought I heard something moving beneath the grate, a slow, deliberate shifting like wet fabric dragging across stone. I stayed there too long. The warmth from the drain soaked into my skin, and the sound filled my head until it drowned every thought. My vision swam with faint pulses of light, as if the humming carried color I couldn't see. A deep, primal fear coiled in my chest, the kind that belongs to creatures older than reason. I stumbled back, breaking the connection. The humming faltered for the briefest second, like a breath caught mid-note, and then returned stronger than before. It felt angry, though no emotion should belong to a sound. I ran up the stairs, my feet slapping the wood, the humming chasing me like a living shadow. I slammed the door and leaned against it, heart hammering. The sound continued beneath me, steady and unbothered, as though it knew I could never escape the foundation it lived in. For the rest of the night, I sat awake, listening. The hum never stopped. It only swelled and softened, like tides against an unseen shore. By dawn, when the first light seeped through the curtains, it finally faded. The silence left a ringing emptiness in my ears. The next day, I tried to ignore it. I left the house for hours, wandering the streets, breathing in the clean autumn air until my lungs burned. But when night fell and the clock edged past midnight, the humming returned. Louder, stronger. I felt it in my teeth, in the fragile bones of my inner ear. Objects began to move. A picture frame slid an inch across the shelf. A spoon trembled in the sink. The hum carried a physical force, a vibration that sought to rearrange the house itself. I taped the basement door shut, stuffed towels beneath it, and still the sound seeped through, rich and alive. Sleep became impossible. The hum invaded my dreams, filling them with endless tunnels of concrete and dripping iron pipes. I woke with nosebleeds, the metallic taste of blood coating my tongue. My skin prickled with static electricity. The house smelled of rain on hot metal, even when the weather was dry. One night, driven by equal parts terror and exhaustion, I returned to the basement. The bulb flickered weakly as I descended, its light barely clinging to the damp air. The drain pulsed faintly, a soft glow leaking through the grate like moonlight filtered through water. I crouched beside it, compelled despite every screaming nerve in my body. The warmth rose again, stronger now, carrying a faint rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The humming deepened until it became a vibration in my bones. Something moved below. A slow ripple disturbed the darkness beneath the grate. Not water, not air, something thick and alive. It shifted closer, pressing against the underside of the iron bars. The hum rose to a pitch that scraped the edges of hearing. My vision narrowed to a tunnel of vibrating light. My fingers trembled as if drawn toward the grate, desperate to touch. I forced myself back, stumbling against a stack of boxes. The drain pulsed once, a single shudder, and then fell silent. The humming stopped. The silence was worse. It was the silence of something waiting. That was 3 nights ago. Since then, the humming hasn't returned. The house is quiet now, almost too quiet. But the drain is different. Sometimes I catch a faint warmth in the air above it, like breath against my skin. Sometimes I think I hear a sound too low to name, a promise beneath the silence. I've stopped going down there. I keep the door locked, but every night, just after midnight, I wake with the unshakable sense that something beneath the floor is humming again. Too deep for ears, too old for words, waiting for me to listen. And sometimes, when the house settles and the air grows thick, I feel it in my bones, a vibration that isn't sound at all. A reminder that the basement has not forgotten me. When I first stepped into the house, the air felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. It wasn't the smell of dust or old wood, though both lingered in heavy layers that clung to the back of my throat. It was something quieter, an almost imperceptible vibration in the atmosphere, as if the walls themselves held a sound too faint to hear but strong enough to feel. Each breath tasted faintly metallic, like the aftertaste of coins pressed against the tongue. The real estate listing had called it a quaint early 1900s home, and that much was true. Tall ceilings, narrow windows, wooden floors that groaned like tired bones. The paint on the banister peeled in thin curls that caught against my sleeves, and the scent of damp plaster leaked from hairline cracks along the hallway. I had wanted something with history, a place that felt alive. At the time, I didn't understand how literal that word could become. My first night passed in uneasy silence. I lay in the upstairs bedroom with the window cracked for air, listening to the house settle. Every old building shifts and pops as it cools, but the noises here had a rhythm that bordered on deliberate. A slow stretching of beams, a soft exhale through the vents, a faint tremor in the floorboards beneath my bed. I told myself it was nothing. It always starts as nothing. The second night, the hour crawled past midnight before sleep found me. Outside, the street was dead, no cars, no footsteps, not even the hum of distant traffic. The quiet grew so deep that it felt pressurized, pushing against my eardrums until I could hear the pulse of my own blood. Then, at precisely 3 o'clock, a sound floated through the house. It was faint at first, a thin thread of melody weaving through the darkness. A woman's voice, soft and unhurried, carrying a tune I didn't recognize. No lyrics, only a wordless humming, rising and falling like breath. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, the hallway, the vents, the very grain of the wood. The notes lingered in the air long after each phrase ended, as if the house itself refused to let them die. I sat up in bed, every muscle locked. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the room completely, curling around the corners like smoke. There was no creak of footsteps, no door opening, just that gentle, impossible humming. The melody wound through me, low and mournful, carrying a weight of sadness that tightened my chest. I waited for it to stop. It didn't. At some point, minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, the humming faded as slowly as it had begun, dissolving into the floor until only the silence remained. When dawn finally bled across the walls, I told myself I had dreamed it. The alternative demanded explanations I didn't have. But the third night stripped away any comfort of doubt. Again, at 3 a.m. sharp, the singing began. This time I heard the faint scrape of something against the floorboards, as if someone were shifting their weight just outside the bedroom door. The air turned heavy and damp, carrying a sweet, rotting odor like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. My breath came shallow and quick, each inhale tasting of mold and iron. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the humming seeped through flesh and bone, vibrating inside my skull until it felt like my own thoughts were singing back. Days blurred into a haze of sleepless anticipation. By evening, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the appointed hour. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor, and the wooden banister felt faintly warm beneath my hand, as if blood pulsed inside the grain. The smell of damp metal deepened each night, coating the back of my throat like rust. I began to notice small changes. Hairline cracks widening in the plaster, faint scratches along the baseboards, a dark stain blooming beneath the window despite the dry weather. The house was shifting, adjusting itself to something only it understood. I tried leaving lights on, but the glow only made the darkness thicker around the edges. Bulbs flickered without reason, casting the walls in a jittering strobe that seemed to animate the peeling paint. The humming always came, perfectly timed, perfectly patient. It never grew louder, never changed key. It simply existed, inevitable as the turning of the clock. One night, desperation drove me to roam the house while the melody played. The stairs shuddered beneath my feet, releasing puffs of cold air that smelled of wet soil and copper. The humming grew clearer as I descended, threading through the wooden ribs of the house until I felt it in my teeth. Every surface I touched, door frames, railings, the edges of picture hooks long stripped of photographs, vibrated with the same faint resonance, as if the sound lived inside the wood itself. I followed it to the basement door. The knob was cold enough to sting my palm, slick with a condensation that beaded like sweat. Behind the door, the humming swelled, gentle but insistent, wrapping itself around my spine. The scent of damp earth leaked through the seam, thick and sweet, like freshly turned soil mixed with something faintly electric. My heart hammered a warning, but some deeper part of me leaned forward, hungry for the source. The door resisted at first, then yielded with a groan that echoed through the house like a low moan. The basement stairs descended into a darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow the weak light from the hallway. The humming floated up from below, clearer now, impossibly close. Each note slid across my skin like a cold fingertip, drawing goose flesh in its wake. I gripped the railing and stepped down. The air thickened with each stair, heavy and wet, smelling of rusted pipes and old flowers left to rot in stagnant water. My shoes sank slightly against the wooden steps, as if the boards had softened with damp. The humming deepened, low and mournful, until the notes pressed against my chest like a physical weight. I reached the bottom. The basement was empty. Bare concrete floor, cracked foundation walls, a single bulb swinging from a frayed cord. Yet the sound was here, all around me, vibrating through the concrete, rising from the very earth beneath the house. The bulb flickered and dimmed, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to sway in time with the melody. I could feel it now, not just hear it, buzzing in the cavities of my chest, curling around my bones. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the silence of absence, but of attention, as if something unseen had noticed me noticing it. The air pulsed once, a soft concussion that rattled the bulb and sent dust cascading from the joists above. In the corner of the room, where the shadows gathered darkest, the concrete glistened with moisture. A single drop of water slid down the wall, leaving a dark trail shaped almost like a mouth. I backed up the stairs without remembering how my feet moved. Each step creaked in slow protest, as if the house resented my retreat. The door closed behind me with a softness that felt intentional, a quiet exhale of wood on wood. Upstairs, the air was no lighter. The walls seemed to lean inward, listening. Since that night, the singing has changed. It no longer waits for 3 a.m. Sometimes it begins at midnight, sometimes just as the sun sets, a soft, patient melody that seeps through every corner of the house. I no longer try to locate it. I know now that there is no source to find. The house itself is singing. Sleep comes in fractured shards. I wake to find small gifts beside the bed. A single black hair curled like a question mark, a smear of damp earth across the floorboards, a faint metallic scent that lingers even after I scrub it away. The banister's peeling paint now reveals a darker wood beneath, streaked with something that looks too much like dried blood. The cracks in the walls have widened into thin mouths, and when the singing begins, the plaster seems to tremble in rhythm. I don't know how long I've been here anymore. The days stretch and fold into each other, marked only by the relentless melody that swells through the night. Outside, the world feels distant, unreal, like a memory I can no longer touch. The house holds me the way a body holds breath, tight, inevitable, waiting. Tonight, as I write this, the humming has already begun, though the clock reads only midnight. The air tastes of copper and damp earth, thick enough to chew. The walls vibrate with a slow, careful rhythm, as if something inside them is breathing. I can hear the melody curling upward through the floorboards, sweet and mournful, welcoming me home. It is not a song of comfort. It is a song of ownership. And I know now that at 3 a.m., it will no longer matter whether I am awake or asleep. The house will sing, and I will listen, because there is nothing else left to do. When I first toured the house, I barely noticed the small room at the end of the upstairs hallway. The realtor's hand brushed against the doorframe, as if acknowledging it without inviting me inside. The rest of the house swallowed my attention. Wide windows staring into overgrown pines. A staircase that creaked like it had been waiting for decades to speak. A faint, pleasant scent of old paper and rain. The nursery sat quiet at the end of a narrow hall, its door open just enough to look like an afterthought. I signed the papers without asking about it. Later, when the keys were in my pocket and the realtor's smile had disappeared into the late afternoon fog, I stood in that hallway and stared at the unfinished nursery for the first real time. The door was lighter than the others, almost chalky under my fingertips. When I pushed it open, a breath of stale air rolled out, cold and dry, smelling faintly of plaster and something sweeter beneath it, something like wilted flowers left too long in water. The room was small, barely large enough for a crib and a chair. Patches of pale blue paint clung to the walls like islands surrounded by bare drywall. The ceiling fan was missing its blades, leaving only a central hub like a blind eye. A single light bulb dangled from a frayed cord, but when I flipped the switch, nothing happened. Dust had settled in perfect stillness, soft as flour. I remember the floor more than anything. The boards were different from the rest of the house, darker, as if the wood had absorbed something over the years. When I stepped inside, the temperature dropped as though I had crossed an invisible threshold. My breath tightened. The air carried a faint metallic taste, like the back of a battery pressed to the tongue. I told myself it was only a room, one that someone had started to prepare for a child they never had time to welcome. Maybe a renovation abandoned mid-process. Still, when I left, I pulled the door gently until it latched. The sound of that small click stayed in my ears long after. The first night in the house passed uneventfully, though I kept waking to small noises, a shifting board, the soft groan of wood settling. By the second night, I learned the rhythm of the place, the heating ducts expanding with a hollow knock, the sigh of wind through the pines outside. It was the third night when I first heard it. A sound, faint and deliberate, threaded through the house well after midnight. It was not the pipes or the wind. It was a melody. I woke with the strange certainty that someone was singing. At first I thought it was coming from outside, a neighbor humming to a restless baby. But the notes were too clear, too close, vibrating through the walls like a warm breath against my ear. A lullaby. Slow, old, unfamiliar. No words, only a rise and fall of sound that carried a pattern too human to dismiss. I sat up, heart pressing against my ribs. The room was dark except for the faint gray wash of moonlight spilling through the curtains. The singing was distant but distinct, and I realized with a creeping dread that it was coming from upstairs. From the end of the hallway, from the unfinished nursery, the melody wound downward like a rope thrown into a well, gentle but relentless. I held my breath, listening for the rhythm of footsteps, the scrape of movement, anything to explain it. There was nothing but the song, soft and almost tender, as if meant to soothe. My skin prickled with the unnatural calm of it. I should have called someone. I should have left the house entirely. Instead, I moved. Slowly, bare feet on cold floorboards, each step a negotiation with the creaks beneath me. The air grew colder as I climbed the stairs, a damp chill that clung to my throat. At the top of the hallway, the sound was clearer. The melody floated from behind the nursery door, weaving through the cracks around the frame. It was low and breathy, like someone humming into cupped hands. The sweetness of it made my teeth ache. The door was closed. I was certain I had left it latched, but now it stood almost flush with the jamb, as though someone inside had pulled it gently shut. A sliver of darkness cut through the seam, darker than the hallway itself. I pressed my ear against the wood. The song stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, swollen, as if the air inside the room was holding its breath. I stepped back, the floor groaning beneath me. No sound, no movement, only the faint scent of something sweet and rotten slipping through the cracks. I retreated to my room and locked the door. The singing did not return that night, but I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around me like a sleeping animal. Days passed. I tried to ignore the nursery, keeping the door closed whenever I walked the hallway. Yet I always felt its presence behind me, a faint pull at the edge of awareness. During the day the house was ordinary, sunlight on wooden floors, the distant chatter of birds in the trees. But at night the air shifted. The lullaby returned on the fifth night. This time it began earlier, just after midnight, soft and patient as if testing whether I would listen. I stayed in bed, eyes wide, counting the beats between each note. The melody twisted, changing in small, unsettling ways. A pause where there hadn't been one. A sudden rise that felt like a question. I couldn't stay still. The sound threaded itself into my thoughts, tugging me upright. I crept into the hallway, heart hammering, drawn toward the door as if pulled by invisible fingers. The light from the moon was sharper tonight, throwing long bars of silver across the floor. The nursery door was open, wide enough to see inside. I froze at the threshold. The air beyond was thick with cold, like walking into the breath of a deep cave. The room looked the same as before, unfinished walls, the hanging bulb. But there was a faint glow that had not been there before. A pale, bluish light pooled in the far corner where the patches of paint were thickest. The lullaby floated from that glow. It had no source, no figure, no instrument, nothing but the sound itself, as if the air were remembering a song and singing it back. The sweetness of it carried a bitter edge now, like sugar left too long in the sun. My skin crawled. I stepped back, but the floor beneath my heel groaned sharply. The lullaby stopped mid-note, cut off like a held breath. The silence that followed was worse than the song. I fled, slamming the door with more force than I intended. The latch clicked, sharp and final. From that night on, the lullaby became a pattern. It never played at the same hour, but always after dark, always when the house was still. Some nights it was faint, a thread of sound that barely reached my ears. Other nights it was almost inside the walls, a vibration that seemed to travel through the bones of the house and into my chest. I tried everything. I played music to drown it out. I stuffed towels beneath the door. I even slept in my car one night, but when I returned in the morning the door to the nursery stood ajar, and a faint echo of the melody lingered in the hallway like smoke after a candle has been blown out. The smell grew stronger. Sweet, cloying, layered with something damp and metallic. I began to notice small details that hadn't been there before. A faint outline on the wall like something once hung there and had been hastily removed. a dark stain in the floorboards beneath the window that deepened with each passing night. I never saw anyone. I never found a speaker, a hidden device, anything that could produce the sound. Only the song, patient and persistent, weaving itself into the bones of the house. The last night I spent there, the lullaby began before the sun had even set. I heard it while washing dishes, a soft humming rising from the floor beneath my feet. The melody spread through the house like water seeping into fabric. When I climbed the stairs, the hallway smelled of roses past their prime, petals slick and collapsing. The nursery door was wide open. Inside, the glow was brighter, washing the walls in a pale, trembling blue. The unfinished patches of paint seemed to shimmer, edges soft as if wet. The melody wrapped around me like a warm hand, coaxing me forward. I stepped across the threshold. The floor was icy, the boards slick beneath my socks. The air pressed against my chest, thick and heavy, carrying the faint sound of a second voice beneath the main melody, a low hum, almost a heartbeat. The bulb above flickered once, and in that brief pulse of light I thought I saw movement. A shape in the corner, small and crouched, like a bundle of blankets waiting to be lifted. When the light steadied, the corner was empty. The song rose, higher, almost pleading. The walls seemed to lean inward. The scent of roses sharpened into something coppery and sharp. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, and the door swung shut on its own with a soft but final click. The melody stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I left before dawn, leaving the keys on the kitchen counter. I didn't pack everything. Some things are still there, clothes, books, pieces of myself I will never reclaim. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I think I hear it again. Faint, almost beneath hearing, a lullaby threading through the dark. And I wonder if the nursery is still unfinished, waiting for someone else to listen. The first night I heard it, the house was so still it felt as though the air itself had been forgotten. I had just moved in a week earlier, and I was still getting used to the sound of a structure older than I was. Wooden beams sighing with the temperature shift, pipes muttering to each other behind walls that carried the weight of a century. I had almost convinced myself that every creak and groan belonged to something explainable. Almost. It started faint, a single thread of sound stretched thin across the dark. A hum. Low at first, like the vibration of a faraway engine or the last breath of a tuning fork. It wove through the silence of the house until I could feel it in the soft cartilage of my ears. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling where the faint yellow glow of a streetlight leaked through thin curtains, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from the street. It was above me. The attic. The attic in this house wasn't the kind that invited exploration. The previous owner had left the hatch sealed with a thin rope of paint that cracked like old bone when I first inspected it. No ladder, just a square panel of wood, stained with a color I couldn't quite name. Something between dust and dried leaves, set into the hallway ceiling. I'd planned to open it eventually, maybe when the boxes were all unpacked and the smell of old varnish stopped clinging to the air. But that night, lying on the couch, I could feel the hum working its way into my bones, and the thought of pulling that panel down tightened my chest. I stayed still for a long time. My eyes followed the faint patterns of light sliding across the ceiling, while the hum above seemed to gather itself like a breath held too long. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, soft rises and falls, like someone idly humming a tune without words. It was almost sweet. Almost. By the time I stood, the air in the living room had cooled. A draft slipped under the hallway door, carrying the dry smell of plaster and something older, like fabric sealed in a trunk for too many seasons. The hum grew clearer as I stepped into the hallway, each footfall making the floor complain in sharp, reluctant cracks. The sound drifted from directly overhead, directly above the thin square of attic door. It was unmistakable now, a low lullaby with no beginning or end. The bulb in the hallway was a weak thing. Its light painted the ceiling in a jaundiced haze that made the panel above look almost soft, like damp paper. I stood beneath it, my neck tilted back until it ached, and listened. The humming carried a strange warmth, like a breath against the nape of my neck. I held my breath without meaning to, and then it stopped. No fading, no gradual silence. Just gone, as if whoever, or whatever, had been making the sound sense my presence and cut it off mid-note. The air felt heavier in the sudden absence, like a room after a door slams. I stood there for what felt like hours, the weak bulb buzzing faintly above me, my heart filling the hallway with its own crude percussion. Nothing else moved. Nothing else sang. I backed away, slow and deliberate, until I reached the living room again. The couch felt too soft, the walls too thin. The hum didn't return that night, but the echo of it lingered in the way the shadows pooled at the corners of the room. I slept in short, fractured bursts, always with one ear tilted upward. The second night it came earlier. I was brushing my teeth when the hum slid through the ceiling, soft and steady, like a voice pressed against the plaster. I spat into the sink and watched the water swirl as the sound threaded through the pipes, riding the vibrations of the house. I could almost pick out a pattern now, something like a melody but not quite human. Too slow to be a song, too precise to be random. I left the bathroom light on as I moved into the hallway. The glow threw long shadows across the walls, bending them into shapes that seemed to lean toward me. The attic panel waited at the center of the ceiling like a sealed mouth. The hum thickened, each note trembling against the wood, until it felt as though the entire house was holding its breath. Again, the moment I tilted my head back and fixed my eyes on the panel, the sound died. The silence afterward was worse than the hum. It was a silence that seemed to press down, filling my ears with a weight that made me swallow just to remind myself I could. I reached up once, fingertips brushing the cool air below the panel, but the thought of touching it sent a small electric panic through my arm. My hand fell back to my side. For the next week the pattern repeated. Each night, the hum returned. Sometimes it began after midnight, sometimes closer to dusk, but always it waited until the house was empty of other sounds. Always it filled the space above me with a melody I could never fully catch. And always it stopped the instant I looked up. By the fourth night, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The air in the hallway carried a faint metallic tang, like the smell left behind after a lightning strike. Dust along the baseboards collected in tiny ripples, as if disturbed by vibrations too subtle for me to feel. Once, I found a single gray feather on the floor beneath the attic panel. It was small and dry, frayed along the edges, as though it had been plucked long ago and hidden in the dark. Sleep became something I chased but never caught. The hum waited for me, patient and deliberate, until the boundaries between waking and dreaming thinned. I would wake to silence, convinced the sound had stopped for good, only to feel the faintest tremor in the walls. A vibration more than a noise, deep and careful, rising from the beams above. One night, though it could have been morning for all I trusted the clock, I decided I had to see. My body moved before the part of me that feared the attic could argue. I dragged the old wooden step stool from the kitchen, its legs wobbling under my grip, and placed it beneath the panel. The hallway bulb flickered once as though warning me. The air smelled sharper up here, a mixture of dust and something sweet but spoiled, like fruit left in a sealed jar. I climbed until my shoulders nearly brushed the ceiling. The panel was within reach, the faint grain of the wood visible in the jaundiced light. My hand trembled as I reached up, the dry surface rough against my fingertips. For a moment, nothing. No hum, no breath, only the faint hiss of blood rushing in my ears. Then, just as I applied pressure to push the panel upward, the hum returned. It was louder than it had ever been, vibrating through the wood, through my arm, through the step stool, and into the floor below. The melody swelled until it was no longer just sound but a physical thing, curling around my bones. It was beautiful in a way that made my stomach twist, something warm and beckoning, but wrong in a way I couldn't name. I froze, my hand still on the panel. The hum shifted, sliding into a pattern that almost resembled words, though no language I knew. My breath caught in my throat, and then, like every night before, it stopped. This time, though, the silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied. Something above the panel exhaled, soft and deliberate. The air around my face cooled, carrying the faint smell of soil after rain. A weight settled above me, no sound, no movement, just presence. My hand dropped, and I nearly fell from the stool in my rush to get down. I didn't open the attic that night. I didn't open it the next night, or the night after that. But the hum still comes. Not every evening now. Sometimes it skips a day, sometimes two, but it always returns. And no matter how long I wait, it always stops the instant I look up. I keep the stool tucked in a closet now. I tell myself I won't go back, that some doors, no matter how small, no matter how close, are meant to stay sealed. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the night presses in, I feel the vibration in the floorboards, a low, patient humming that never quite leaves. And I wonder if the attic is waiting for me to look up, or if one night it will stop waiting altogether. I moved into the apartment at the end of a damp October, when the air tasted faintly of rust, and the city outside seemed to be breathing its last warm sigh before winter. The building was old in a way that carried more than just age. It had the kind of heaviness that clung to the air like a film of oil. The bricks were dark with decades of rain, and the hallways smelled faintly of wet plaster, old paint, and something harder to define, like paper that had rotted in a locked attic for too long. The unit itself was narrow and dim, a one-bedroom pressed against the far side of the complex, with thin walls and vents that stretched like a hidden network through the ceiling. The landlord handed me the keys with a smile that never reached his eyes, as if he wanted the transaction to be over before the silence of the building reminded him of something. I barely noticed. I was too busy imagining the sound of my own footsteps echoing through an empty space that would soon be mine. The first night passed uneventfully, though I lay awake longer than I wanted. The radiator ticked in uneven patterns, and the vents gave soft, hollow sighs whenever the wind shifted. I blamed the building's age for every creak and whisper, telling myself that old structures speak in their own language. But around 2 in the morning, a faint melody drifted through the air. It was so soft that at first I thought it was my own mind filling the silence with something to keep me company. A slow, lilting tune, wordless but deliberate, carried through the vents with the fragile persistence of breath. It wasn't a radio. It wasn't a neighbor's television. It had the texture of something sung directly into the metal, thin, reedy notes that vibrated in the ducts and pooled in the corners of the room. I froze under the blanket, eyes fixed on the shadowed ceiling. The song did not falter. It wound through the vents in uneven measures, sometimes swelling slightly before fading to a near whisper. It was old, I could feel it, an arrangement from some other time, something that belonged to cracked vinyl records or dusted sheet music left forgotten in an attic trunk. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I pressed my ear to the vent above the bed. The metal was cold and faintly damp, and the song hummed through it as though the duct itself were the throat of some hidden singer. No words, only a melody that looped like a lullaby warped by memory. By morning the sound was gone, replaced by the brittle quiet of an aging building. I told myself it was a dream stitched into wakefulness, a trick of half-sleep and old pipes. But the smell of iron lingered in the air, faint but undeniable, like the scent of blood diluted in water. The second night, the song returned. This time it came earlier, around midnight, slipping through the vent in soft threads. I turned off every appliance, every possible source of noise, and sat on the floor beneath the vent with my knees drawn to my chest. The tune seemed to slide through the ducts above me, moving from one room to another, pausing in the kitchen before gliding back toward the bedroom. It carried a subtle tremor, as though the singer's breath quivered with effort. The air near the vent grew cooler, and with it came a faint odor, old wood soaked in rainwater, the musk of a closet left closed for too many seasons. I pressed closer, my breath fogging the metal. For a moment, the melody slowed to a near stop, like someone pausing to listen back. Then, with a sudden swell, it continued. Higher now, sharper, as though answering an unspoken question. Sleep became impossible. Each night the song arrived a little earlier, and each night it grew clearer, as if the source were moving closer through the labyrinth of vents. I began to notice details I had missed before. The faint scrape of something metallic when the last note hung in the air, the subtle resonance of a throat clearing in the silence between verses. During the day, the building revealed its age in small betrayals. Paint flaked near the window sills, revealing older layers beneath. The hallway smelled faintly of scorched dust when the heating kicked on. Neighbors rarely passed, and when they did, they walked quickly with their heads down. The laundry room in the basement was a maze of concrete pillars and rusted pipes that dripped steadily into dark stains on the floor. I searched for any sign of a tenant who might sing late at night. A radio, a television left on, but the hallways remained stubbornly quiet. On the fourth night, the melody shifted. It began as before, soft and wavering, but halfway through it stumbled into a pattern I hadn't heard before, a minor key that seemed to bend the air around it. My chest tightened as I realized it sounded almost human now, less like a tune and more like a breath shaped into something between humming and weeping. The vent vibrated beneath my fingertips. The metal was icy, slick with a thin film of condensation that smelled faintly metallic, like rain striking old pennies. I followed the sound. Barefoot, I crept through the apartment, tracing the melody as it floated from vent to vent. The kitchen grill exhaled a draft that smelled of damp stone. The bathroom vent trembled slightly, as if something inside shifted when I leaned close. The song seemed to retreat whenever I moved, pulling me through the rooms in a slow, deliberate chase until I stood at the small square hatch in the hallway ceiling, the entrance to the maintenance crawl space. The hatch was sealed with a single rusted latch. Beneath it, the music pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and low. I reached up, fingers brushing the cold metal. The instant I touched the latch, the song stopped. Silence crashed down so heavy it felt physical, pressing against my ears. I stayed there, arm raised, skin prickling as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, from deep within the vent, a single note rang out, long and trembling, like the last breath of something ancient. It faded slowly, dragging the silence with it until the building felt hollow. I slept with the lights on after that, though sleep was a generous word for the restless hours I spent staring at the ceiling. The air tasted wrong, like dust disturbed after years of stillness. The smell of iron never left. By the sixth night, I stopped waiting for the song. It waited for me. As soon as the sun set, the air in the apartment grew heavy, dense with a pressure that pushed against my chest. The vents rattled softly, as if something inside them shifted closer to the openings. When the melody began, it was no longer a distant hum. It came from everywhere at once, above, behind, inside the walls, folding around me in slow, deliberate waves. The tune was no longer soothing. It carried weight now, a rhythm that seemed to tug at my heartbeat, coaxing it to match its pace. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the faint light from the hallway. Somewhere in the dark ducts, something exhaled in time with the song. A soft scrape followed each drawn-out note, like nails dragging gently across sheet metal. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the melody did not dim. It vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself, until it felt like the sound existed inside me. I don't remember when I finally moved. Maybe it was instinct, maybe panic, but I grabbed my keys and fled into the hallway, the door slamming behind me. The song followed, seeping faintly through the cracks like smoke. I didn't stop until I reached the street, where the city's damp October air tasted almost clean. I never went back. Later, I learned from a neighbor, spoken in a hushed, reluctant tone, that the unit had belonged to an elderly tenant who'd lived there for decades. He was a quiet man, they said, who spent his nights singing old songs to himself long after the building had gone to sleep. One night, he simply stopped leaving the apartment. Weeks passed before anyone realized he hadn't made a sound. By then, the smell had already spread through the vents. They said his body was found sitting beneath the very hatch I had touched, his mouth slightly open, as though he had died mid-song. Sometimes, in the colder hours of the night, when the wind scrapes along the edges of the city, I swear I can still hear that melody riding the drafts. Thin, patient, echoing through vents I can no longer see, waiting for someone else to listen. It began as a faint impression, something so delicate that I mistook it for the sound of my own body betraying me. Breathing, when you think about it too long, becomes unnatural. You feel the air stretch down your throat, the rise and fall of your chest. That night, in the narrow bedroom I had only just claimed as my own, I became aware of it with an unnerving clarity. Each inhale dragged like a slow tide, each exhale scraped against the silence like sandpaper. But it wasn't the breathing itself that unsettled me. It was the way it didn't sound entirely alone. The room smelled of old paint and wood that had absorbed decades of other people's lives. Damp corners carried a faint sourness, like paper left too long in a cellar. The single window faced a dark courtyard choked with vines, their leaves brushing against the glass whenever the wind wandered through. Streetlights from a distant road tried to find their way in, but only managed to leave a thin silver wash across the floorboards, revealing a scatter of dust I hadn't yet cleaned. The radiator along the far wall clicked as it cooled, each metallic pop carrying like a pebble thrown down a well. Beyond those small sounds, the house was deathly still. Too still. It came with the next exhale. A low vibration, almost imperceptible at first. A note that didn't belong to the creak of wood or the hum of distant traffic. I froze, lungs still, waiting to see if I'd imagined it. My breath spilled out anyway, slow, uneven, and there it was again. A humming. Soft, deliberate, so faint it felt less like a sound and more like a tremor in the air. The tone hovered just beneath the register of my own breath, as though something was leaning close enough to match me. I tested it. A shallow inhale, a sharp release. The hum followed, syncing perfectly with the rhythm I set. My heart began to pulse in my throat, an irregular beat against the careful cadence of air. I told myself it had to be some trick of acoustics, the pipes beneath the floor, the old wood adjusting to the night. But when I held my breath entirely, the room did not fall silent. The hum lingered for a fraction of a second longer before dissolving, like a voice waiting for permission to continue. I pressed my palms against the mattress and listened harder. The bedspread was coarse under my fingertips, the fabric whispering as I shifted. The humming did not return. My own breathing, ragged now, filled the space. When I allowed a cautious exhale, it slid back in, soft and patient, matching the length of the sound I made as if it had been waiting for my cue. The air felt heavier with each cycle, thick enough that every inhale brought a faint taste of iron. My ears strained to locate it. It wasn't coming from the hallway, not from the vents, not from outside. The sound existed everywhere at once, as though it was a property of the air itself. I could almost feel it in my chest, a vibration that seemed to begin inside me and yet remain undeniably other. I sat upright, the bed springs groaning under my weight. The room tilted slightly, the edges of the furniture blurring in the thin wash of moonlight. The window's reflection stared back at me, a faint outline of my own form in the glass. My shadow trembled with each shallow breath. I waited, listening to the quiet static of night. I tried another breath, long, deliberate. The hum stretched with me, perfectly in tune, as though a hidden throat had opened in the dark. I remembered reading once about people who suffer from auditory hallucinations, how the mind, deprived of sound, will invent its own. But this wasn't a random noise. This was responsive, precise, intentional. If I quickened my breath, the hum matched. If I slowed, it followed. A companion sound. A parasite. I left the bed, bare feet sinking into the chill of the wooden floor. The boards flexed beneath my weight, their dry creaks loud against the quiet. I tried to catch the hum by surprise, holding my breath and stepping silently toward the door. Nothing, only the faint ticking of the radiator. The air tasted stale, like copper and old rain. My chest began to ache from the stillness. When I finally released the breath I'd been holding, the hum swelled back into existence, right against my ear, perfectly synchronized. A tremor rippled down my spine. I pressed a hand to the wall. It was cool and rough with uneven paint, but no vibration traveled through it. The sound remained bodiless. I turned slowly, scanning the room. The lone dresser with its warped mirror, the low ceiling where faint cracks spidered across the plaster, the corners swallowed by shadow. Nothing moved, and yet the hum seemed to move with me, circling, shifting to wherever I turned my head. I stepped into the hallway. The house opened before me in a yawning darkness, stairwell vanishing into a lower void. The air here smelled different, a dampness like wet soil, as if the night outside had crept inside. I held my breath again, testing. Silence. I exhaled slow. The hum resumed, flowing along the edges of my breath like smoke tracing a draft. It was closer now, though no direction held it. Downstairs, the kitchen window glowed faintly from the streetlight beyond. I reached the bottom step, each footfall a hollow thud that echoed too loudly. My breaths quickened despite myself, and with them the hum grew sharper, like something pleased to be invited in. The sound was not only matching me anymore, it was harmonizing. A faint second tone layered itself over the first, weaving through the cadence of my lungs until the two were indistinguishable. The refrigerator loomed as a pale shape in the corner, its faint motor hum almost, but not quite, the right pitch. I approached it, thinking maybe it was the source. My hand touched the handle. The metal was cold enough to sting. I held my breath, leaning close. Silence. The appliance was innocent. When I exhaled, the voice rose against my cheek like a breath from behind. I spun. The kitchen was empty, every surface gleaming faintly in the half-light. My own reflection stared back at me from the dark glass of the microwave. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a shadow standing just over my shoulder in the reflection, something tall, blurred by the thin light. But when I turned, only the bare wall met my eyes. I backed away, heartbeat pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my wrists. My breathing had become erratic, and the hum followed each frantic gulp of air like a mocking echo. Up the stairs again, 2 steps at a time, I fled to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. The latch clicked with a sharp finality that made the silence afterward feel even deeper. The air in the room felt charged, as if a thunderstorm had pressed itself against the roof. Dust motes floated in the moonlight, each one seeming to vibrate. I crawled back onto the bed and sat cross-legged, chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. I tried to slow it, to regain control. The hum slowed too, settling into a deep, resonant tone that seemed almost tender. It wrapped around the rhythm of my breath, shaping itself to every fluctuation. Minutes or hours passed. My sense of time eroded beneath the constant, patient sound. I became hyper-aware of my own body. The faint rasp of air against my throat, the pulse behind my eyes, the way my ribs expanded and contracted like a tide against the shore. The hum wove itself into those sensations until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. Each inhale felt like I was feeding it. Each exhale, an invitation for it to grow. At some point, fatigue began to dull the edges of fear. My eyelids drooped. My body slumped back against the headboard. The hum deepened, vibrating through the mattress, through the floor, through the bones of the house itself. My breathing slowed to a crawl. The sound matched perfectly, two notes now inseparable, a single resonance filling the dark. I don't remember falling asleep, only the sensation of being absorbed, my breath no longer my own, my body rising and falling in a rhythm that felt guided, sustained by something unseen. When I woke hours later, pale daylight spilling across the floor, the house was silent. Too silent. I drew a deep, deliberate breath. No echo answered, only the hollow sound of lungs filling and emptying in a room that smelled faintly of cold metal and damp earth. Yet even now, days later, when the night grows deep and the world outside finally stills, I catch myself listening. Each breath I take feels like a question. Each exhale waits for an answer I can almost hear. A sound lingering just beyond the threshold of silence, patient and eager to sing again. I never thought a bathroom could feel alive until I moved into that apartment. It was a narrow, second-floor unit in an aging brick building on the edge of town. The kind of place where the hallways smelled faintly of old carpet glue, and the windows were always a little greasy no matter how much you wiped them. The bathroom was small, just a square of off-white tile, a chipped sink, and a mirror so large it dominated the entire wall above the vanity. That mirror would become the reason I still sleep with the lights on. From the first night, the bathroom felt different from the rest of the apartment. The air inside was heavier, slightly damp even when I hadn't showered. It carried a faint metallic tang, like the smell of a wet penny pressed against your tongue. The overhead bulb flickered at odd moments, not in a violent strobe, but in a subtle dimming, as if something unseen occasionally passed between the filament and my eyes. At first I chalked it up to the building's age. Old wiring, bad ventilation. It made sense. But the mirror, God, the mirror, felt wrong from the start. Its surface wasn't perfectly flat. If I leaned close, the glass seemed to ripple faintly, a distortion too delicate to be a simple flaw. My reflection wavered just enough to make me feel as though the person staring back wasn't fully tethered to me. The humming began on the fourth night. It was past midnight. I had just brushed my teeth and turned off the tap when I heard it, a faint, low vibration. At first I thought it was a pipe behind the wall. The sound wasn't musical, not exactly, but there was a strange rise and fall to it, like a single note held by a human throat. A hum, soft and steady, seeping from somewhere behind the mirror. I leaned closer. The glass felt cool under my palm, colder than the surrounding air. The humming deepened, vibrating against my fingertips as though the mirror itself had become a speaker. I stayed like that for a long time, my hand flat against the surface, listening. The sound was oddly soothing, like a lullaby buried in static. When I finally pulled away, the humming stopped mid-note, as if it had been waiting for me to leave. The next night it returned, louder, clearer. This time, the pitch matched the rhythm of my breathing. When I inhaled, the hum climbed higher. When I exhaled, it dropped. A perfect harmony. I stood there, mesmerized, matching its tone until I couldn't tell whether I was guiding the sound or it was guiding me. There's something unnerving about hearing a sound that seems to know you. The hum wasn't random. It felt responsive. Each breath I took, each slight change in the tension of my chest, the mirror echoed it with uncanny precision. Days passed, and the humming became part of my nightly routine. I would brush my teeth, wash my face, then linger in front of the glass, breathing in and out as the mirror hummed back at me. The world beyond the bathroom faded into irrelevance. The hum was patient, gentle, addictive, but soon the mirror began to change. Tiny beads of condensation appeared even when the air was dry. They formed faint, symmetrical patterns, circles, spirals, something like fingerprints left by a hand larger than my own. When I wiped the surface, the marks returned within minutes, glistening faintly in the dim bulb's glow. The cold spot where my hand had once rested never warmed again. It felt like pressing my skin against a stone buried deep underground. Then came the vibrations. They started so subtly I thought it was my imagination. A barely perceptible tremor beneath my fingertips. But each night, the glass shivered more violently, like a held breath about to be released. One evening, while I leaned close enough to fog the surface, I saw something impossible. My reflection smiled when I hadn't. It was small at first, a twitch at the corner of my mouth. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The reflection's chest continued to rise and fall, perfectly matching the hum, while I stood rigid and still. Slowly, deliberately, its head tilted, a fraction of an inch, toward the left. I hadn't moved at all. The humming deepened, vibrating through my skull. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the threshold, and the sound ceased instantly. The reflection returned to normal. My own wide-eyed stare looked back at me. No smile, no tilt, only the faint quiver of the light above. I tried not to return the next night. I told myself to brush my teeth in the kitchen sink, to leave the bathroom light off. But by midnight the pull became unbearable. The hum didn't wait for me anymore. I heard it through the walls, a low resonance threading through the apartment, beckoning. When I entered, the mirror greeted me with a deep, resonant tone that vibrated in my chest. The patterns of condensation had multiplied, swirling into shapes that almost resembled letters, though not in any language I recognized. My reflection stood perfectly still as I approached, but the air between us quivered like heat above asphalt. I raised my hand. The reflection matched me, but a fraction of a second too late. That delay, barely a heartbeat, felt like an invitation. The glass was colder than ever, biting against my skin. The humming swelled until it filled my head completely, drowning out the weak buzz of the ceiling light. I realized, with a kind of cold clarity, that the sound was not coming from behind the mirror. It was coming from inside me. My chest vibrated with it, my bones resonating like tuning forks. Then, for the first time, I felt pressure from the other side. Not just cold, pressure. A gentle push, as though another palm pressed against mine from within the glass. I couldn't move. My breath quickened, and the hum quickened with it, a perfect echo. I stared into my own eyes, only they weren't mine anymore. They were darker, deeper, like holes leading into an endless tunnel. A faint smile bloomed across the reflection's face, spreading wider than my muscles could possibly stretch. The pressure increased, the glass bulging outward by the tiniest degree. My reflection's mouth opened, but no breath escaped. Instead, the hum sharpened into a single, piercing note that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. Something cracked, not the glass, but something inside my head. I stumbled backward, breaking contact. The sound cut off like a wire severed. The bathroom fell into silence, so heavy it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. My reflection stared back, expressionless, perfectly matching my own once more. I left the bathroom light on that night. I slept poorly, waking again and again to the faintest suggestion of vibration, as though the building itself were humming under my bed. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep. But when I entered the bathroom, the mirror greeted me with a faint, familiar note, soft, patient waiting. I didn't touch it. I didn't even brush my teeth. I just stood there, watching as the glass fogged slightly despite the cool morning air. My reflection smiled again, slow and deliberate, a beat behind my own heartbeat. That was weeks ago. I've stopped trying to fight it. The hum follows me now, faint but constant, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the bones of my skull. I no longer need to breathe for it to match me. It knows the rhythm of my heart. Sometimes, when I stand before the mirror long enough, I feel the surface soften under my fingertips. The glass isn't glass anymore. It's something thinner, something waiting to open. And every night, the humming grows just a little louder, as if whatever waits behind the mirror is getting closer, matching not just my breathing but my thoughts, my pulse, the very shape of me. I know one night, soon I won't be able to step back. And when that night comes, I don't think the person in the reflection will be the one who stays. I never thought silence could have a melody until I moved into the house on Dovetail Road. From the outside, it looked harmless, just another aging rental with a patchy lawn and a roof that sagged slightly toward the east. The realtor described it as quiet, a word that at the time sounded like a promise of peace. But the quiet here wasn't empty. It had a texture, a faint grain, like the sound of a distant radio behind thick walls. The house wasn't still. It breathed. The first few days passed without anything remarkable. I unpacked my boxes under the weak glow of ceiling bulbs that buzzed with the fatigue of old wiring. The living room, though bare, was immediately my favorite spot. Wide and rectangular, it faced a cracked picture window that framed the street like a faded photograph. The floorboards were a muted chestnut, scuffed and dry beneath a thin layer of dust that resisted every sweep of the broom. At night, the air inside carried a faint sweetness, something like dried flowers left in an attic for too many summers. I told myself it was nothing, just the smell of age and old wood. The first night it happened, I was sitting in that empty living room with a cup of tea that had gone cold. The street outside was silent, no passing cars, no late-night walkers. It was the kind of hour when even the neighborhood dogs seemed to hold their breath. At first, I thought I heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a low, steady drone. But the sound grew clearer, richer, more deliberate. Notes emerged where there should have been none. A melody, faint, almost hesitant, as if someone were humming a lullaby 2 rooms away. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the room I sat in. I set the cup down and held my breath. The tune continued, soft but unmistakable, a sequence of 4 rising notes followed by a slow, downward glide, repeating over and over. It was simple, childlike, but carried a strange precision, as though whoever, or whatever, was producing it knew exactly how it should sound. The air vibrated with it, not loud, but present enough that my chest seemed to resonate with each gentle rise and fall. I checked every corner of the room, even pressed my ear against the walls. The sound did not grow stronger or weaker. It was everywhere at once, filling the space like a mist. When I switched off the light to listen more closely, the tune stopped. The silence that followed was too sudden, too complete, like a door slammed in a dark hallway. I stood there for a long time, the outline of the window glowing faintly from the street lamp outside, waiting for it to return. It didn't. The next morning I blamed exhaustion. Moving in, unpacking, maybe my mind was just inventing music out of fatigue. But that night, and every night after, the melody returned. Always at the same hour, always in the same room. It began shortly after midnight, rising from the stillness with the inevitability of a tide. The pattern never changed. For gentle notes, a breath of silence, then the downward drift like a sigh. Over and over, weaving through the air until it felt as though the room itself were breathing along with it. I started noticing other details. The air in the living room was always cooler than the rest of the house, even with the heater running. The wooden floor held a faint vibration, a subtle quiver that I could feel through the soles of my feet when I stood barefoot. The smell of dried flowers grew sharper each night, carrying a hint of something metallic beneath it, like pennies left too long in the sun. I tried to fight it. I played music through my phone, turned the television volume up, ran the dryer late at night just to fill the silence. None of it mattered. The tune slipped through every barrier, threading itself between notes of static and dialogue. It wasn't loud, but it was patient, carving a space for itself until all other sounds seemed thin and temporary. On the 4th night I sat in the center of the living room floor, lights off, determined to understand where it came from. My eyes adjusted to the darkness slowly, revealing the faint outline of the window, the dry gleam of the floorboards, the pale rectangle of the ceiling. The humming began exactly on time. But this time something changed. The melody thickened, as if more than one voice had joined. A faint harmony floated beneath the main tune, lower and slower, like an echo that had learned to sing along. It circled me, moving from wall to wall, though no air stirred and no shadow shifted. My ears strained to catch its origin, but there was none. The sound belonged not to the walls or the floor, but to the space itself. The room was the instrument. I tried recording it on my phone. When I played the file back the next morning, all I heard was silence. Not even the ambient hiss of an empty room. Just a clean, perfect void. Sleep grew difficult. Each night I sat awake waiting for the melody. Part of me terrified it might not come, another part dreading that it would. My body began to recognize the hour instinctively. Even if I managed to doze off, I woke seconds before the tune began, heart hammering, skin prickling with the anticipation of sound. By the end of the first week, I no longer thought of it as a random phenomenon. The tune was deliberate. It followed a pattern too precise to be chance. The pauses between repetitions matched the rhythm of my own breathing. When I inhaled, the melody held. When I exhaled, it descended. It was listening. One night, desperate for an explanation, I explored every inch of the room. I crawled along the baseboards, checked the heating vents, knocked on the floorboards for hidden hollows. My fingers traced the edges of the window frame, where old paint flaked beneath my nails like dry skin. In one corner, where the wall met the floor, the wood felt faintly warm, a gentle heat that pulsed once before fading back to cold. The tune swelled slightly when I touched it, then softened when I pulled away. The discovery should have frightened me more than it did, but by then fear had become a background noise. What unsettled me most was how familiar the melody had begun to feel. I caught myself humming it while washing dishes, tapping its rhythm on the steering wheel while driving to work. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the day with the tune already in my throat, as if I had been singing in my sleep. Neighbors had little to offer. Most of the houses on Dovetail Road were rentals, occupants coming and going too quickly to share history. The few who had lived there longer shrugged when I asked if they'd heard anything strange. One elderly woman across the street squinted at the house and said it had good bones, but her expression tightened when I mentioned the living room. She changed the subject without explanation. The melody persisted, night after night, precise, patient. On the 12th night, I stayed up later than usual, determined to confront it somehow. Midnight came. The air grew colder, the smell of dried flowers sharpened, and the melody began its familiar rise. But this time I hummed along. The room responded. The harmony thickened, enveloping me in a sound that vibrated through bone and blood. The floor trembled with a subtle rhythm, as if something beneath it were stirring in time with the tune. My voice wavered but continued, drawn forward by an urge I couldn't name. The melody slowed to match my pace, adjusting with me like a partner in a quiet dance. When I finally stopped, the room continued for a single phrase before fading into silence. For the first time, it ended on a note that wasn't part of the pattern, a low, lingering tone that sank deep into the floor and left the air shivering. Since that night, the melody hasn't been content to wait for midnight. It slips into the hours of daylight, a faint hum beneath the sound of traffic or conversation, a shadow beneath the voice of whoever happens to be speaking to me. Sometimes it comes from the ceiling, sometimes from my own chest. I don't fight it anymore. I listen, because now I understand. The living room isn't empty. It never was. And every night, when the tune begins, it isn't just the room that sings. It's me. I am part of the melody now, and the melody is part of me, an endless, patient song that will keep rising and falling long after the last light fades and the last breath settles into silence. The first time I heard the faint melody coming from the upstairs hallway, it was sometime after midnight. I had been lying awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of my grandmother's old house, letting the creaks and sighs of the wooden frame settle around me. The summer air outside was warm, but inside the house there was a persistent chill that clung to the edges of the walls, as though the building itself refused to let go of winter. My grandmother had passed away a few months earlier, and I had returned to help clear out the last of her belongings. The house smelled exactly as I remembered from childhood: dried lavender, furniture polish, and something faintly metallic, like old keys kept too long in a damp pocket. The melody drifted into my awareness like a slow leak of cold air. It was not music in the normal sense, more like the faint hum of a single human voice tracing the skeleton of a lullaby. There were no words, just a soft rise and fall, repeating every few seconds as though whoever, or whatever, was humming had only a few notes to offer. It seemed to come from the locked closet at the end of the hallway. A closet that, as far as I knew, had been sealed shut for decades. I had always known about that door. As a child, I was warned not to touch it. The paint on the frame had been reapplied so many times it looked like layers of compressed dust. The brass knob was dull, with faint green tarnish creeping around its edges. I had once tried to peek through the thin gap at the floor, but found only a slice of absolute darkness, the kind of dark that feels heavier than air. My grandmother never explained what was behind it. She would simply shake her head when I asked, her lips pressed tight as if she feared words might wake something sleeping on the other side. The next morning, sunlight filled the hallway, making the wooden floor glow like old honey. I told myself it had been nothing more than the settling house, the wind, or perhaps the memory of some distant music carried on night air. But when I stood near the closet door, I felt a faint draft coming from the keyhole, cold and damp, carrying a scent like wet stone and rotting paper. The smell seemed impossible in a house that had been sealed for years. My grandmother had always kept everything immaculate, yet this closet exhaled decay like a living thing. As the days passed, the humming returned. It was never loud, never intrusive, always just soft enough to make me question whether I was imagining it. The notes were deliberate, slow, and achingly familiar in a way I couldn't place. I would wake to it around the same hour each night, between midnight and 1, and each time I would lie perfectly still, listening as the sound traced the outline of a melody I felt I should know. It reminded me of something half forgotten, like a dream you can almost recall but never fully catch. I began to notice other changes. The air near the closet grew cooler as night deepened, heavy with the faint odor of mildew and iron. The floorboards outside the door seemed to bow slightly, as though under some unseen weight. The paint around the frame, once smooth, began to bubble in tiny patches, like skin reacting to a burn. And though the house was silent during the day, I started hearing soft clicks from the closet in the afternoon, as if small objects were shifting inside when I wasn't looking. One evening, while sifting through my grandmother's boxes in the living room, I found an old wooden music box. The lid was cracked, its surface carved with swirling patterns of ivy and stars. Inside lay a small brass cylinder and a row of tiny metal teeth. When I turned the crank, the mechanism groaned but managed to release a fragile tune. The notes that spilled out were slow and deliberate, the same pattern I had been hearing at night. My chest tightened as I listened. The melody was exactly the same. Underneath the music box, wrapped in yellowed tissue, was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was my grandmother's, neat but trembling with age. It contained only a few lines of music and a single word beneath it, remember. No explanation, no date. Just that word, and the tune I now realized I had heard long before I returned to this house. Memories bled through the edges of my mind. I saw myself as a child, sitting on the rug while my grandmother hummed softly, running her fingers through my hair. It had been a bedtime song, a lullaby without words. She never told me where it came from. I had forgotten it entirely until now. The recognition sent a cold ache through me. If this was her song, then why was it echoing from behind a locked door in an empty house? That night, the humming began earlier. I was downstairs when the first note floated through the air, clearer than ever, so sharp it felt almost tangible. I climbed the staircase, each step groaning like a warning. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, the shadows at its edges swelling like black water. The closer I moved toward the closet, the more distinct the tune became. It was no longer a faint hum, but a low, resonant vibration that seemed to live inside my bones. When I reached the door, the knob was cold enough to sting my fingers. The paint on the frame pulsed subtly, as if breathing. I pressed my ear against the wood, and heard not just humming, but a faint scraping, like fingernails tracing the inside of the door in rhythm with the melody. My heart pounded with a dull, heavy rhythm. The urge to open it was overwhelming, but the key was long gone. My grandmother had hidden it, or destroyed it, years ago. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the sound weaving through the silence until my thoughts began to fray. The melody shifted subtly, bending notes in ways that felt wrong, almost predatory. It no longer sounded like a lullaby, but something older, something that remembered me even if I didn't remember it. I backed away, but the humming followed, filling the hallway even as I fled down the stairs. Sleep became impossible. Every night, the tune seeped through the walls, threading itself into my dreams. I started noticing faint marks on the floorboards near the closet, thin scratches that curved into spiral shapes. The smell of damp stone thickened, clinging to my clothes. One morning I woke to find the music box sitting on my bedside table, though I had left it downstairs. Its lid was open, and the crank turned on its own, releasing the first few notes of the cursed melody before grinding to a halt. I tried leaving the house, but whenever I returned, the air outside felt wrong. Too bright, too loud, like the world had shifted slightly out of tune. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Birds refused to perch on the roof. The house seemed to pull me back with invisible threads, as if something inside the locked closet was waiting for me to acknowledge it. On the final night, the humming began before dusk. The sound filled every corner of the house, vibrating through the walls like the heartbeat of a buried animal. I climbed the stairs in a trance, the music box clenched in my fist. The closet door looked different, warped, swollen, as though something behind it pressed outward. The knob turned easily now, no longer locked. When I pulled the door open, the smell of wet earth and rust poured out, heavy and suffocating. Inside was not a closet at all, but a narrow stairwell descending into blackness. At the top step sat a small figure, hunched and swaying. Its shape was human but blurred, as though half forgotten by the world. It hummed a lullaby in my grandmother's voice. The sound reached into the deepest parts of me, dredging up childhood nights and the warmth of her embrace. twisted now into something cold and endless. I wanted to run, but my body moved forward. The music box slipped from my hand, striking the wooden step with a hollow clatter. The figure tilted its head, and though I could not see its face, I felt it smile. The melody slowed, deepening into a single, endless note that filled the air like a held breath. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the faint click of the door swinging shut behind me. I woke the next morning in my own bed. The house was silent, the closet door closed and locked as if it had never been opened. The music box lay on the floor beside me, its crank still turning. And faintly, just beneath the sound of my own breathing, the melody played on, soft, patient, waiting for me to remember what my grandmother had tried so hard to keep hidden. I've always had a fascination with sound. Not music, exactly, but the textures of silence, the small imperfections in recordings, the way air vibrates when no one is speaking. I started recording ambient noises when I was a teenager. Rain falling against a window, the groan of wooden stairs late at night, the slow drip of a leaky faucet echoing through an empty house. There's something about capturing what most people ignore that feels almost sacred. But the day I recorded the humming voice, that day changed the way I listened forever. It was late October when the air first began to feel heavy. The kind of cool that isn't crisp, but damp, the kind that lingers against the skin like breath. I had driven out to an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town, a place I'd visited once before during the day. From the road it looked like any other forgotten property. A sagging roofline, windows filmed with grime, weeds curling around the porch posts like fingers. Inside, it was quiet in the way only empty places are, layers of dust muffling the world, a silence that swallows footsteps before they can settle. I went in late in the afternoon, just before the light began to drain from the sky. My recorder was already running, the small red light blinking like a patient heartbeat. The wooden floor sighed under my weight. Each creak sounded deeper than it should have, as if the house itself was listening. I moved room to room, holding my breath, letting the microphone drink in the emptiness. The smell was thick and old, rotted wallpaper, wet soil, a faint metallic tang like rusted nails. In the kitchen, I could still smell the faint sweetness of something that might have once been fruit, long decayed into sugar and mold. By the time I reached the upstairs hallway, the daylight outside had collapsed into that pale gray half-darkness that makes everything look underwater. The walls were peeling in long, curling strips. A single window at the far end let in a thin, dying glow. I stood there, recording, my breath fogging in the cold air. That was when I first noticed it, a faint vibration just beneath the silence. Not a sound, not yet, but a pressure in the air, like the atmosphere tightening around me. I stayed very still. The recorder caught everything, but my ears strained for what my mind insisted wasn't there. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a note began to rise. A hum. Low at first, so soft it might have been the blood moving behind my eardrums. Then clearer. A single, steady tone, too smooth to be the house settling, too deliberate to be the wind. It wavered just slightly, like a voice carried through water. I looked behind me. The staircase was empty, the room still and shadowed. My own breath sounded ragged and human against that inhuman consistency. The hum grew warmer, rounder, a sound that felt impossibly close but without a source. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It wasn't vibrating the floor. It was everywhere and nowhere. I pressed my recorder tighter in my hand, the small plastic shell slick with sweat. Through the tiny headphones, the sound was clearer than in the room itself, a gentle, unbroken humming, like someone standing inches from the microphone. But there was no one. I spun in place, heart punching against my ribs, but the hallway remained as empty as when I entered. Only the hum, steady as breath, filling the space where silence should have been. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that half-light. My sense of time stretched thin, each second slow and syrupy. The hum began to shift in pitch, just slightly, like a melody trying to form. A rise, a fall, a pattern almost like a lullaby, but fractured, as if whoever was humming had forgotten how the tune was supposed to go. I felt it more than heard it, like the sound was moving through my chest, vibrating my bones. I could taste metal in the back of my throat, as if the air itself had turned electric. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was not the ordinary quiet of an empty house. It was a silence with weight, a silence that pressed inward like a vacuum. I realized I was shaking. My thumb fumbled against the recorder's stop button, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. I wanted proof. I needed proof that it wasn't just my imagination. I backed down the hallway, my footsteps almost soundless on the splintering wood. The dying light outside made the window panes look like dull, watchful eyes. Every shadow stretched too far, reaching for me as I moved. When I finally stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a shock. The world beyond the house felt unnervingly normal. Distant traffic, the faint hiss of wind through dry grass. I stood in the overgrown yard until my heartbeat slowed, staring at the blank windows that stared back. At home, I transferred the recording to my computer. I told myself it would be nothing. Wind through broken glass, some subtle resonance of the house settling. I hit play. At first there was only the soft crunch of my own footsteps, the occasional shift of wood. Then it came, the hum. Clear, strong, intimate. It filled my headphones with a warmth that was almost human. Listening to it in the safety of my apartment should have made it easier. It didn't. If anything, it was worse. Through the microphone, the hum sounded closer, richer. I could hear tiny breaths between the notes. A faint wetness in the mouth of someone who shouldn't exist. I leaned in, breath held, every hair on my body rising. Beneath the hum, just at the edge of perception, something else surfaced. A whisper, not words, more like the sound of lips forming shapes without sound. I turned the volume higher, isolating the frequencies, filtering the noise. The hum grew sharper. The whisper grew clearer. It was not the house. It was not the wind. It was a voice humming directly into the microphone. But I had been alone. I replayed the file again and again, searching for some mechanical explanation. A feedback loop, an artifact of the recorder. Each time, the voice remained, steady, deliberate, impossibly close. On the final playback, something new emerged. In the last few seconds of the file, just after the hum cut off, there was a faint exhale. Not mine, not a sigh, a breath. A soft, deliberate breath, as if whoever, or whatever, had been humming wanted me to know they were still there. I haven't returned to that farmhouse. The recorder still sits on my desk, the file saved and backed up in 3 places. Sometimes late at night, I play it again, just to remind myself that it's real. Each time, I hear something different. Tiny variations in pitch, subtle shifts in the rhythm of the breath. Sometimes, if I listen long enough, I swear I can hear a second hum layered beneath the first, faint and patient, waiting for me to notice. I don't record empty rooms anymore. I can't, because once you capture a sound that isn't supposed to exist, silence is never just silence again. Every quiet corner feels inhabited. Every breath of wind carries the echo of that voice. And sometimes, when my apartment is still and the night stretches too deep, I hear it without the recording. The same low hum, rising gently from nowhere, as if someone is standing right behind me, softly reminding me that they never really left.